Statistics show us that there's a huge de-churching happening right now. You got 40 million plus people leaving the church in droves. And what's interesting is if you look at those statistics and that data, about 35% of the 40 million people leaving churches are leaving because they're not feeling connected to the church and to the congregation. And so as we got kind of chatting strategically, Richard, you and I were talking about what would it look like for us to help churches start a podcast that would be a low barrier point of entry for people who are coming into the church trying to be engaged in what's happening.
Welcome to PBP.FM, brought to you by Push Button Podcasts, your go-to resource for grabbing attention, building awareness, and creating authority in your marketplace. I'm Richard Matthews, your host and guide through the wonderful world of podcasting as a driver of business. Here, we teach how to use a multimedia podcast as the cornerstone of your omnipresent content marketing strategy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, podcaster, expert, or thought leader, you'll discover creative ways to leverage your digital content. From blogs to video, from YouTube to TikTok, and everything in between. I'll show you how to stand out from the noise so you can directly connect with potential customers, build strategic partnerships, and drive leads into your business. Get ready for actionable tips and tangible takeaways on improving your digital presence across the board. With that, let's dive into this week's episode of PBP.FM.
Hello and welcome to this call. If you're seeing this call, you probably just heard from Chris or myself. We're for Reach Out for Push Button Podcast. We wanted to hop on and record a quick little video for you on why these couple of guys might be reaching out about a podcast for your church. And Chris, as our Chief Podcast Strategist, I know this is something that you've been chatting a lot about. You want to tell the story a little bit about why we're reaching out to churches and why you think what we're going to talk about here might be really useful for them?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. So I think that, it's interesting. Push Button Podcast has been around for 7+ years. We've helped multiple organizations and businesses start podcasts for their businesses. And we as a team got together and realized that many of us are Christian. We're believers. And we're like, why are we not reaching out to churches and talking to them about potentially helping their church start podcasts? And so, that's how the initial idea kind of got moving. And from there, we're like, well, let's take some massive action to reach out to these churches and see how we can help.
Awesome. And so that's for us, we talk regularly about things like Paul being a tent maker, right? Our business in the podcasting space is really, it's how we build our revenue and our ability to grow and serve in the church. And what's, I think, interesting to me is that the stuff that we build with Push Button Podcasts just sort of like dawned on us that like it would also be beneficial to churches. And there's a lot of different ways it could be beneficial to churches, but how do you think a podcast would be benefit to a church, sort of like at a high level? And then we can talk in specifically some of the strategies that you think would be useful for a church.
Sure. So having been in the church and involved in a lot of different ways, from playing on the worship team to serving, and then sometimes even going to churches. And actually, right now, my family and I have moved to a different state and we're looking into churches. So I've seen it from all different angles. And I think typically what you find is you find a podcast that churches use and they take their sermon series and they put it on the podcast. And that's all fine and good. I think there are other unique angles, though. There are some churches that have their pastors and their co-pastors, kind of discussing their sermon prep and kind of what God's doing in their church in terms of sermon prep that's really relevant to their congregation. Another really interesting idea that I feel like God laid this on my heart one time, and I reached out to my pastor. I was like, hey, do you want me to, help the church with this? And this was before I had moved out of state, so I didn't have time to do it. But I've always felt it's really interesting when you look at churches. First off, statistics show us that there's a huge de-churching happening right now. You got 40 million plus people leaving the church in droves. And what's interesting is if you look at those statistics and that data, about 35% of the 40 million people leaving churches are leaving because they're not feeling connected to the church and to the congregation. And so as we got kind of chatting strategically, Richard, you and I were talking about what would it look like for us to help churches start a podcast that would be a low barrier point of entry for people who are coming into the church trying to be engaged in what's happening, and then, open up an application and see a podcast that says, hey, are you new here? Check out our podcast. And the podcast would actually be interviews with members of the congregation. And the idea here would be, for instance, someone might be a closet non-tither for years. And then, God really convicts their heart and says, hey, you can't outgive me, right? And then they would have a story of how all of that changed. And then someone might have lost a child or, just really deep things that go on. That way, when you go to meet people, you have a deeper layer of conversation ready to have because you've listened to their testimony and because their story's been breathed out. And the church podcast allows people to be able to kind of see all that transpire.
Yeah, yeah, that's really fascinating. One of the things that we talk about all the time, just as a podcasting company, and then me personally on my own show, we talk about how humans are what I call a storyborn people. And what I mean by that is you can see this reflected in all of our language that we judge our relationships with other people in our lives based on how much of their story that we know, right? And
Mm,
so a stranger is someone that you know their name, or you don't know their name and you don't know their story. An acquaintance is someone who you know their name, but you don't know any of their story. And a friend is someone you know their name and you know some of their story. And a best friend
that's
is
good.
someone you know their name and you know so much of their story that like the only way to get to know them better is to go out and have new experiences together and to share those stories with each other. And so what you're talking about then is just like leveraging the stories that are in your church as a way to help everyone build that community. Is that sort of where you're going with that?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I'll give you an example. I was at a fire pit one time with our church, and there were, 30 guys sitting around, and it was a guy in the church who had been a huge part of the church. He was on the worship team, and he was serving within the church, and, everyone knew and loved his family. But he explained to us that he was struggling with something that, many of the other guys around the fire were struggling with. And it then allowed people to open up about what was happening in their lives. And then, it became a point of like, wow, if that guy was struggling with that and he got through it, like, man, I can now talk to him. I can actually, he could mentor me and help me through this. But no one would have ever known if he didn't have a chance to breathe out what was happening in his life and what God was doing. And so, what better medium
To
than a
tell this story.
podcast, which is such an intimate experience for people to be able to hear these testimonies?
Yeah, absolutely. And just making it a regular part of the church, both for building the church internally, but also as a way to like outreach and have your message being poured into your community.
Yeah, definitely. And then from there, the church can take the podcast any direction they'd like to take it. But initially, I think a lot of churches have thought, man, we've always thought of starting a podcast, but never really thrown our resources into it or really put pen to paper on it. And so I think this is an opportunity to start a show, to have a company come in and do everything for you from design all the way to helping plan content and then actually getting the show ready to hit record and go. And then from there, the church can take it whatever direction they want, but at least they started the show and there was purpose behind it.
Yeah, yeah. A good purpose and a good thing to do with the show. And then, yeah, our company literally does everything else. So the only thing you have to do is show up with the content and, push the start, stop, record button, and Push Button Podcast takes care of everything after that. But it gives you a good idea, at least on a way that your church could use the stories that are already there to help sort of, and the technology that we have access today to really push stories and push the message.
Are you ready to amplify your influence and stand out from the noise? Join Richard Matthews on PBP.FM as he explores the power of podcasting, social media, and strategic content to boost your reach. You'll discover the latest trends in video, audio, and influencer marketing, plus unlock insider tips to create binge-worthy content spotlighting you as a leader. With upbeat energy and clear, empowering advice, Richard guides publishers, experts, and entrepreneurs on starting a podcast, improving social strategy, and connecting with your perfect audience. Visit pbp.fm and book a podcast strategy session to start spreading your message today.
So at this
Right.
point, someone has heard from us. You get a little bit of a chance to see who Chris is, who I am. We have another, 17 people on our team. We're a small creative organization. Chris, is there anything else you want someone to know before we send them like, hey, click the little link that's below this video to book a call with you?
Yeah, well, I think oftentimes strategically, whether it's a business or an organization or a church or whatever, we're so busy and we're thinking of like the next thing that we need to accomplish, but we miss the big picture of why we do what we do. And when we look at the church, we do what we do because we want to draw people to the church because we ultimately want them to, have a relationship with Jesus and get in community and realize that, the church is going to be a massive part of, families and righteousness growing and all the things. And so at the end of the day, I think it's important for us to think like, where's our highest and best use of time as an organization? And is it the right move strategically to say, sure, let's see what these guys have to say in hopes of starting another ministry within the church?
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for coming on and sharing your ideas today, Chris. If you're watching this, you did get an email from us or you got a LinkedIn outreach message from us. Hopefully this gives you just an idea of why it might be really interesting to sit down with Chris. The link below this video should be pbp.li/strategy. That'll take you to book a time on Chris's calendar to talk about, how we could use a podcast strategy to help you in your church. And again, the link will be below this video. Thank you for coming and sharing your time today, Chris.
You got it, man. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks for joining us this week on PBP.fm. Make sure to visit our website, pbp.fm, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. And if you'd like to get help building an omnipresent content marketing strategy with a podcast and you want help, you might want to book a podcast strategy session with us at pbp.fm. Just click the Book a Strategy Session button and book a time on our calendar. We look forward to speaking with you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.